So, what is Russian influence up to in Europe again? Ladies and gentlemen, let's take a look at what's going on. Because we were watching the military parade in Moscow in 2026 with Chet here, marking the anniversary of the end of the Great Patriotic War. And it was interesting how small and weak that parade was, how few allies showed up there. There were actually only North Koreans there who sent some of their soldiers, but there were damn few political delegations too. And of course, the fact that it's the 81st anniversary, not the 80th or 75th, will also have an influence on that. That's clear, I understand this symbolism. However, even in such a case, it shouldn't be so small and so weak. And I would say that so far it's much more than just being such a not particularly important anniversary. So let's take a look at what we have so far. Because you won't believe it, but Fortress Europe is holding, Putin's allies are falling. And it really is starting to look that way. When you think about it, even though the media space is full of talk about how Russia is always influencing something, Russian propaganda, Russia affecting something, Russian agents, pro-Russian politicians, and so on and so forth, let's take a look at how it really is. Because it seems to me that all this fear-mongering about Russia that we have isn't based on Russian successes. It's based on Russian ambitions, but when you look around Europe, it actually seems rather optimistic. So please write in the comments if you feel the same way. And after presenting you here with a whole range of Russia's successes and failures, I'd say you'll understand my perspective. And let's start with the first point. Let's start with Putin trapped by paranoia. Putin is a man in a bunker, afraid even of his own generals. Of course, I don't want to perpetuate this narrative that Putin is hiding in a bunker or anything like that, but it's interesting to know that in Russia, there are rumors spreading that some generals, maybe Shoigu, want to overthrow Putin. The idea that Shoigu would want to overthrow Putin is, of course, nonsense. Just like the idea that Gerasimov would want to overthrow him, because Shoigu and Gerasimov are people Putin chose mainly because they are loyal, and he picked them because they would never be able to stage a coup since they could never gather enough allies. Also because of where these two people come from and what their ethnicity is. In racist Russia, these people would never be able to gain enough allies. However, none of this is the case. It doesn't have to be true, and it's probably not true. It's probably information that comes from European intelligence services and is meant to function as a psychological operation against Russia and people who support Russia, because even if you don't believe it, even if you rationalize that Shoigu would never betray Putin, that Russian generals are vetted and so on, if European intelligence services start releasing or it starts leaking that clouds are gathering around Putin and someone wants to overthrow him, it can plant a seed of doubt. A seed of doubt here, a seed of doubt there. Suddenly Putin might start making strange decisions because he gets scared, because he starts thinking, maybe there's something to it, maybe they're right, definitely not, but what if? He starts to waver. Suddenly, his wavering could lead to some decisions that could increase the likelihood that someone actually gets really angry, some general or some minister who might be able to gain support, or just the fact that they might not trust each other could cause them not to share information as well as they should, which would create a certain instability, a certain problem in the Russian Federation and its leadership. So I see this as a rather interesting European Psyops by European intelligence services against Russia, which could at least partially work because this information is spreading on Russian information channels as something that's at least interesting. So that's the first point that tells me that we Europeans have some initiative and some ability to resist the Russians and maybe even go on the counterattack when it comes to information warfare. Another point that I find quite interesting is the so-called Hungarian point. I would sum it up as the Hungarian point because it concerns Fico, Peter Magyar, and Orban. Fico, a big supporter of Russia, was at the parade last time. His government, whenever they try to find a problem, usually blames Ukraine, blames everyone around, and says they have plenty of excuses just so they don't have to blame the Russians and Putin. So it's an absolutely collaborationist government that nobody in Europe trusts. But at this moment, even Fico isn't so stupid as to openly align himself with Putin in the sense that he would be on the podium. Because Fico went to the parade, but he didn't actually take part in the parade. He just laid flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The question is, what does the unknown soldier think about that? In my opinion, he probably had his own idea, but Fico laid flowers at the tomb of the unknown soldier and didn't take part in those propaganda festivities on Red Square. Why didn't he take part? Because his position is weakening and he doesn't want to unnecessarily appear as someone who's on the losing side or someone associated with Viktor Orban, who suffered a brutal defeat in the elections. At this point, he has even given up his parliamentary mandate, and Magyar's party is cleaning house and moving forward like crazy. Just like Fiala promised to dismantle Agrofert's influence, Peter Magyar is promising deurbanization, but he actually has the courage and the mandate to do it. So things are really moving in Hungary, and Fico has lost a big supporter there. Russia has lost a huge ally in Hungary, and even though Peter Magyar will never be on Ukraine's side, he also will never be on Russia's side. And that's a huge loss for the Russian Federation, a huge defeat for the Russian Federation, and in a way, a huge victory for Europe, the European Union, the European states, and our civilization. And with Peter Magyar winning in Hungary, with the European Union's actions against Viktor Orban's Russian colony, by cutting their subsidies, by using propaganda, our own actions led the Hungarians to deal with their pro-Russian puppet themselves, and an anti-Russian figure won there. And this anti-Russian figure, of course, has a huge influence on Fico as well. And by taking down Hungary, we also, in a way, took down Slovakia. And of course, we also largely prevented things from going wrong in the Czech Republic. Because Babiš, theoretically, in my opinion, could have had an inclination towards Orban and Fico if Orban had stayed there. But the fall of Orban not only dealt a blow to Fico, and of course not only dealt a blow to the Hungarians, but also dealt a blow to Babiš in the sense that, okay, sorry, but we're not going east. The money and popularity are in the west. Macron and so on will talk with Peter Magyar, will cooperate with the Slovaks, but the Slovaks are actually pretty calm now. So Andrej Babiš sees the money in the west. He doesn't see anything in the east anymore. The only one still pulling us to the east is SPD, and that's a very, very marginal party. So even in the Czech Republic, there's no risk that a shift towards Russia would happen in any way. There will probably be a shift here towards lowering the level of the fight against corruption, increasing clientelism, and simply increasing political arrogance. All of this will probably happen here, but it won't be towards Russia, it will be towards the West. Russia won't have a solid footing here. So this sums up a list of clear European victories against Russian influence operations. Then there are some controversial situations like the cabinet of Prime Minister Bologin in Romania. 2 weeks ago, the ruling coalition in the country collapsed, so the government fell. The government fell because the socialists left the coalition as they were against reducing debt and against reducing the welfare state in Romania. And there is a high probability that if there were early elections in Romania, the party that would win would be nationalist, supports the unification of Romania. In other words, the annexation of Transnistria and Moldova, and is, of course, anti-Ukrainian. And clearly Eurosceptic. So all of this is a huge risk in Romania, that it could happen, but be careful, this is important. Nationalists in Romania are more of a shield against Russia than its collaborators. The nationalists will go after Moldova, after Transnistria. They will be Eurosceptic, but they won't side with the Russians. In a way, this is like a game where the Russians might, through their influence operations, manage to pull Romania out of the orbit of the EU and European civilization, but they won't be able to draw it to themselves. It's a kind of partial win. It's a win for the Russians in the sense that they could theoretically mess something up in Europe, but it's definitely not a win in terms of gaining an ally. It will rather reduce the number of possible allies for Europe and European countries, and that's certain unity. But first, it's not guaranteed. There are still ways to work with it. And second, disunity is not an alliance. Even though the Russians benefit from a certain level of disunity, it's still not an alliance. So we'll see how things develop in Romania. If there are early elections there, it's likely the nationalists will win, and we might very well see some pressure on Moldova, or some talks with Moldova. At this point, Moldova is also putting pressure on Transnistria because they feel there's an opportunity to get Transnistria back. For example, they've completely isolated the local politicians and generals there, and they're carrying out some political agitation in that direction. And overall, they're creating propaganda pressure on the population of Transnistria, that all of this can happen. It will be really interesting to watch what happens between Romania and Moldova, because even in Moldova, there's quite a strong sentiment for unification with Romania. Not many people know this, but Romania and Moldova are, in a way, one country, one nation, formerly one state that was divided by the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union annexed the Moldovan part of Romania. But in Moldova and Romania, the people are quite similar in many ways, and actually the language is the same too. The only difference is that in Moldova they use the Cyrillic script, while in Romania they use the Latin alphabet. But both countries speak Romanian and are inhabited by Romanians. Yeah, to sum it up, so that's the first point. Romania is definitely leaning more towards Euroscepticism, but it's not going down the path of being pro-Russian or collaborating with Russia. And then we have the pro-Russian former president aiming for victory. Europe will have a replacement for Orban. Ondřej Groch, Četek Adem, Seznam Zprávy, you really showed your true colors again, huh? Radev is not a replacement for Orban. Radev is more or less a guy who criticizes aid to Ukraine, but at the same time, he's someone who criticizes aid to Ukraine because Bulgaria is a country in total disarray. Yeah, so in this regard, again, we see more nationalism in it. A certain economic reality, of course, a reaction to the fact that one government after another has fallen there and that Bulgaria is an extremely politically unstable country. So what's happening? I meant Bulgaria, not Romania. So Bulgaria is an extremely politically unstable country. So what's happening in Bulgaria is actually quite similar to what's happening in Romania, that in some way the government is just changing to a more nationalist, more Ukraine skeptical one, but not a more pro-Russian one. So in this regard, it's important to realize again that neither Romanians nor Bulgarians will ever be pro-Russian in the same way Orban was, just as a Hungarian won't be pro-Russian, but also won't be pro-Ukrainian. Overall, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria are moving more towards the position of nationalism, cooperation with Europe. They won't be pro-Russian in that sense, not pro-Russian in that way. They won't be pro-Russian or cooperate with Russia because it just means having a boot on their neck and it brings nothing. So that's how I see it in this regard. As a Russian failure that they were unable to gain those allies, and although they managed to get those countries to maybe support Ukraine, they failed to make those countries significantly Evropu. Což je nedostatečné. That would probably suit the Russians more, and we know that's their goal. Those countries would destabilize Europe, because a destabilized Europe is good for Russia. They wouldn't really need it if those countries were outright on Russia's side. It would be enough for them if those countries destabilized Europe. But the very fact that in Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, there are mostly nationalists who still want to communicate and cooperate with Europe in some way, that's not enough Russian influence. It's not enough of a Russian victory. I would rather call it Europe's ability to defend itself against some kind of Russian destabilizing influence. But now, of course, we also have to go to Germany, where the AfD is actually praising the people from Brno and criticizing Tomio Okamura. So maybe it's the breakup of an old partnership. Hard to say. Nevertheless, the AfD is, of course, basically a Russian fifth column in Germany. Overall, the AfD is more complicated. It also depends on the local branch, right? From one federal state to another. Some parts of the AfD are more reasonable, some parts are more messed up, but overall, the AfD is probably quite connected with those Russian people. But even though the AfD is currently competing strongly with the CDU and CSU, it will never have 40% on its own to form a government by itself. And as long as the AfD doesn't have 40%, given how things look in Germany, it will never be in power. At most, it might be in power in a federal state, which, hey, can happen, but it will never be in power in the Reich. In the Reich, in the Bundestag, in the federal parliament, in the federal assembly. That's right, not in the Reichstag. That's a slightly different part of history. However, what always happens is that the CDU, CSU join with the Greens, or with the SPD, or with some other party, or there will be a traffic light coalition, something like that, rather than letting someone from the AfD govern. In this respect, the AfD simply has no chance of coming to power in Germany under the current conditions and climate unless there is some brutal crisis, a huge pandemic, or something else. It doesn't. That's how it is. And then, of course, we're looking here at National Rally, you know, the French party, Le Pen and Bardella, these people. And with them, of course, there's a risk that they could win the elections, that they could have a president, definitely. But another thing is that this is more or less, again, mainly a nationalist party that has managed to distance itself from Russian influence and Russian money. So if anything, this group would be more like Peter Magyar here, rather than just Robert Fico or Viktor Orban. Overall, of course, we're not in a good situation. We're definitely not in a perfect situation because Russia is messing things up here. It's definitely undermining But we can see that lately we've been getting rid of politicians who were openly pro-Russian and who would actively collaborate with them, and we're rather replacing them with people who, out of some pragmatism, cooperate with Europe. They might be nationalistic, but that's not really a significant obstacle. They don't actively support Ukraine, but they do allow their companies to sell things there, which is kind of, I don't want to say a happy medium, but it's a kind of non-victory for Russia. Definitely not a brutal defeat, but in a way, to sum it up personally, I consider it a better outcome than I expected. Yeah. It all could have turned out much worse. For example, Orban could have stayed in power, Fico could have broken away, his group could have dragged the Czech Republic with them. On top of that, theoretically, Rassemblement National might not have distanced themselves from Russian money, and Reform UK, who are now heading for victory in the UK, they're also not openly pro-Russian, In Romania, people who are directly connected to Moscow could have won. All of this could have happened, but none of it did. What happened was the weaker outcome. It's better than it could have been, and personally, I consider it a fairly solid victory. So that's that. Ladies and gentlemen, please write in the comments how you perceive the current situation in Europe. Are we winning? Hard to say, yeah. It's really one of those situations when you sit, look at Europe, evaluate it, you see Magyar, you see Radev, you see Romania, and you say, damn, it's not exactly perfect, it could be better, but the Russians actually didn't succeed. They really didn't succeed, right? Yeah? Yeah? It would be enough for them to mess up Europe, but even that isn't working, because those nationalists obviously want to cooperate and want to talk. They won't exactly go to Moscow for instructions. They're not Orban's people. It's hard to say. It looks good. It looks good. Personally, I'm an optimist. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. Thanks a lot for being on the stream. If you were here today, keep coming back to the streams, of course. See you next time. Take care, support the content, and see ya.